I registered to vote on campus. I was walking to my next class and there were people registering people to vote. And I was interested, so I went over and registered. And they gave me a card and a pen, filled out the card and signed my name, and I handed it back to them. And they took my card, and then later I found out that some guy I had never met had completely recopied my card, signed my name pretending to be me, and turned in the fraudulent card to the elections office. And I'm just really concerned because this guy took my social security number and he could just open accounts in my name, and he stole my identity.
My name is Stephen Pappas. I live in a town called Los Olivos, California. That's a quiet little valley area behind Santa Barbara. I decided to run for local office in 2008 because I was convinced after working with the government on some community projects that they weren't being straight with us, they weren't sharing what their real intentions were, and the public was being kept in the dark. A lot of people encouraged me to step forward and try to make some changes, and I did.
And so we decided to look at David's registration card. So the vote was discounted. So we noticed that David...
My name's Samantha Fagert. I'm 25 years old. I live in Santa Rosa, California.
Kind of by word of mouth, somebody gave me Samantha's phone number, who was going to the university at the time at UCSB, and met with her, liked her energy, and from that she brought on other people and kind of developed a whole student network out in the campus.
Steve was running for supervisor of this district. He seemed to be somebody who was down to earth and interested in really representing the constituents instead of some outside interest. My name is Nancy Crawford Hall and I live in the San Ynez Valley.
Here's the thing, I've been a registered nonpartisan for over 10 years. I'm not part of any machine. The people with me are not part of any machine. We are just the average guy, and maybe I'm the average guy that decided that I wanted to try to make a difference.
Or the energy that surrounded Steve and his tent and all of the people that came up to us was very, very supportive, very interested in what he was doing. I think a lot of the students really liked that he was an independent candidate, that he wasn't a face associated with any sort of machine. He was Steve Pappas. He was just your everyday kind of guy, and I think the students really appreciated that and liked it about him.
It looked really positive for him becoming the next supervisor.
I spent a lot of time campaigning at the campus. I had a lot of student support.
The Daily Nexus, the student newspaper on the UCSB campus, strongly endorsed him. Day after day, we had a lot of big articles talking about Steve and what the benefits of voting for Steve were.
We took an internal poll about a week before. It showed we were either tied or we were winning, so we felt that we would at least perform competitively at UCSB. So on election night on 2008, I had my local community friends and some of the people that worked on my campaign, kind of a quiet evening at my house, and we watched the results come in on the TV.
And he was well ahead in votes until it went to UCSB, and then all of a sudden everything flipped, and we were astounded. What happened? We didn't understand.
Suddenly, instead of being ahead by 3 points, I was behind by 3 points, and so we were a little taken back.
By looking at those numbers before the election, we knew that it was going to come down to the UCSB campus, and so that is where our attention went when we saw the numbers after the election and he lost by only so many votes.
Then the next day, my campaign assistant called me and said, I'm looking at the results of the UCSB precincts, and I think you need to come to the office. So I ran down there, she had him up on the computer, and what we immediately saw was very alarming when we looked at the specific precincts to the University of California, Santa Barbara, one after the other was showing over 100% turnout, meaning if you had 500 students or people registered, you're getting 505 votes. And this was happening from precinct to precinct. In fact, one precinct had 130% turnout. And when we added all 9 precincts together for that UCSB area, it still came out to 101%. So we knew right away that something wasn't right. And from there begins our story.
I'm not into politics, but common sense tells you there's something seriously wrong, and the more we looked, the worse it got.
When we went to the county registrar's office, it almost seemed like we were bothering them, that they had done everything that they could to make sure the election turned out right, and we were in there kind of seeing the mess that they had and wanted to get some organization and some answers, and they weren't very willing to help us out or to give us the information that we were looking for.
This is the Santa Barbara County Elections Office. They never did give us an explanation as to why this occurred. In fact, what they did tell us is that this is the way it always is at the university, and that was the end of the explanation. So we decided to obtain the backup to the election, see all the documents ourselves, and do our own investigation.
The process of going through the documents was extremely lengthy. We had a team, we called the students back to come and help us go through every single registration card that had been turned in for the precincts, and we literally thumbed through about 30,000 registration cards and highlighted where there were discrepancies, and that's when the patterns started to show up, where we were seeing different people's names pop up over and over and over again with clear evidence that they had filled out these registration cards, that the signatures didn't match from the registration card to the vote by mail ballot or the provisional ballots.
And when we started to actually look at signature comparisons between, for instance, a vote by mail envelope and that same voter's registration card, or the polling roster and that same person's registration card, and when those signatures did not match one after the other, it went from curious to we've got a huge problem. And it wasn't just signatures not matching. There were all other kinds of things going on. Hundreds and hundreds of cards in the same handwriting. And when you looked at the signature, apparently the same signature style. So we had to actually decide at that point, where do we go from here? Winning the office I was running for became irrelevant to the scope at which we were looking at the potential voter integrity problem in our county and maybe across the country. That became the new issue. That became the new priority. Not winning an election, but trying to find out who's doing this and how do we change it. So our next step was we decided that we needed to get this body of evidence to a law enforcement agency. This is the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Department. This is where we ultimately brought all the evidence for the sheriff to review.
Steve and I both went, because I know Mr. Brown. And Steve brought his black bag with him. And we sat in Sheriff Brown's office for a good hour while he asked questions about the information that we had. And Steve would reach into his black bag and hand him the evidence.
He was so concerned he actually signed 2 of his own investigators to do their own investigation, and 2 weeks later after that I got a phone call from them, spent about another 6 or 7 hours answering all their questions, bringing more evidence. They ultimately did their own report, which came out about a month later, and the conclusion is that there were numerous violations of election codes, there were numerous felonies that occurred, and they ultimately did their own report and sent the entire body of evidence up to the Secretary of State Fraud Unit so that they could do their own investigation go forward.
I have no doubts whatsoever that there was fraud going on. The disorganization in the system and the fact that there were people that had been hired to do these registration drives that come from out of town, out of the state, and even just the fact that they held on to so many registration cards and turned them in last minute to flood the system, it shows that they have an awareness of what happens, how to get away with things, and how to slide things under the belt.
When we further investigated those names, one by one, we found out that they were all part of a broader network across this country that went from one campus to the other, to the other, to the other.
That made me really angry, because I figure if you go to the trouble to vote, it's one of the things that makes the United States different from the rest of the world. You do have real elected representatives, or at least you're supposed to. That's what everybody believes. But I'm beginning to find out that that's not true.
So when we really started to look at how widespread this is, we became even, if you can believe it, more alarmed. It wasn't just in our backyard. You've got state after state that have thousands and thousands of dead people registered to vote, and they haven't purged their registrations in years. You've got instances where every vote in a particular county went to one candidate. And I mean precinct after precinct, 500, 700 votes, 1,000 votes. Not one vote for anybody else but the one candidate. You know, very highly suspicious, okay? You have people voting multiple times in multiple states. And it goes on and on and on and on.
I think that some kind of ID should be required, but I think it has to be very fair in that it's something that everybody has access to.
There's no reason not to have a photo ID when you're voting. It's just an excuse.
I'd like to see a voter ID. There are so many things that you cannot do in this country without an ID card. I think this argument that a voter ID is disenfranchising people and stealing the vote is ridiculous.
It's very important that we have proper identification in order to vote. We require identification for every other thing we may need to do here in this country, and I think that voting should be one of those things as well to ensure the integrity of our votes.
We have lived lives of convenience for so long. Sometimes it seems like we're in a Pixar movie where there are rounded corners on everything, and we just sort of float through life and everything turns out okay in the end because it's America. History tells us that the nature of man is such that if you do not stay ever vigilant in defense of your own liberty, it will be taken from you. History is replete with examples of great nations falling because they forgot who they really served. Does vote fraud happen at the polls? Absolutely. Does mail-in ballot fraud occur? Absolutely. It's difficult to find. Fact is, there have been prosecutions or convictions of vote fraud-related crimes in 36 states in the last 18 months. That's a problem.
When I worked at Acorn, I saw all types of different levels of fraud. One of the main things I can tell you about is voter registration fraud. When you have massive amounts of cards that are being submitted to the election agencies across the country, at the last minute, they know that there is a high instance of fraud. It was something that we discussed, and it was something that was planned for. At the same time, not only were they copying these voter registration cards and giving them to funders, but they were also had people that were encouraged to put names out of phone books, dead people, people that had moved, anything they could to meet the quota. There was a quota that each person had to meet or they were fired. In order to get that, they were trained to do whatever it took to get that number. And bad thing about it is that Project Vote itself was being paid per voter registration card. So if they said they registered 1.3 million voters, they were paid per card, and they were going to do whatever it took to get that 1.3 million number, even though they were forced to admit later that half of those registrations were not valid.
4 years ago, I guess now, I was leading a very off-the-radar life. My husband and I are small business owners, raising our kids, working on the farm, and I got involved, started an effort to work at the polls, and flash forward, here we are. It's a national movement, and I think we're getting awfully close to things that make some folks very uncomfortable. The outcome of elections changes the direction of this country. Let's look at what happened in Minnesota in 2008 when there was a down-to-the-wire election between Norm Coleman and Al Franken.
In litigation that occurred, at the end, Al Franken was declared the winner, a little over 300 votes out of 2.9 million cast. We now know, because of the investigation of a citizens organization, that almost 1,200 felons voted illegally in that election. That's 4 times the margin of victory.
After months and months, and many recounts and surprise ballots being found in the back of someone's trunk, well, Al Franken became a 61st vote in the Senate that ultimately passed through the Affordable Care Act that we now call Obamacare. Whether or not you're for it, that's what it came down to. Now, since then, there have been well over 100 prosecutions of vote fraud that occurred in that election. There's more fraud that's been proven in that election than the spread of the votes themselves. That would have changed the course of this country.
We began to notice that across the country, the margin of victory is getting smaller and smaller. I will tell you that when I was working with Acorn, we registered between 2004 and 2008, 7 million voters. When you see how that goes across the country, especially considering that a number of those voter registrations were fraudulent, it's only a few 100,000 here, a few 100,000 there. Put that across the country in these different precincts, and you have your margin of victory that's large enough to decide a presidential election.
The average citizen should be concerned because of the fact that today the government controls so much of their everyday lives. And who you elect and put into office at the state, local, and particularly federal level these days may affect your ability to run a business, be employed, what you can and can't say, your First Amendment rights. All that's affected by who you pick to represent you.
It's always curious to me, where is the outrage over what's happening inside of our polls or what isn't happening inside of our polls? To date, 46 states have prosecuted or convicted cases of voter fraud.
More than 24 million voter registrations are invalid, yet they remain on the rolls nationwide.
There are over 1.8 million dead voters still eligible on the rolls across the country.
More than 2.75 million Americans are registered to vote in more than one state.
True the Vote recently found 99 cases of potential felony interstate voter fraud.
Maryland affiliates of True the Vote uncovered cases of people registering and voting after their respective deaths.
This year, True the Vote uncovered more than 348,000 dead people on the rolls in 27 states.
Federal records show 160 counties in 19 states have over 100% voter registration.
In California alone, we found 49,000 dead people still on the rolls.
What I have learned about the citizens of California is we are all very much alike. Every one of us, regardless of party affiliation, we believe in freedom.
Right now, I've talked to people across the state, and I hear more often than I should, is that I no longer believe my vote counts, and I know people who've stopped voting because they don't believe it either. The plus of returning integrity to the election, we will all go to the polls. We will vote. We will know our vote counts. Now, our candidate may not win, but I'm okay with that as long as it was a fair, honest election.
We are jeopardizing the integrity of our votes because we don't have the proper security mechanisms in place to make sure that there's not fraud happening, to make sure that every vote counts. And let me tell you, when there is fraud in my community, when there's when there is fraud taking place in my neighborhood, it affects me. It's my vote, and it's usurping the power of the next generation. And I think it's critical that we make sure there are all the security mechanisms in place to protect our votes.
For so many years, there have been detractors that have tried to make it seem like voter fraud was a myth, that it was something that people just did because they wanted to suppress votes. So where everyone is looking at voter suppression tactics on this side, we have groups moving on the other side towards stealing elections.
Vote suppression is wrong. We should be concerned about making sure that everyone who is eligible to vote has an opportunity to participate in a process that's free and fair. And that doesn't mean, though, that with that right to vote doesn't come some level of responsibility.
I mean, you have to have an ID to get into the Justice Department. You have to have an ID to get into what they were talking about, the NAACP convention. You have to have an ID to get into almost everything that is anything of importance, where you have to verify who you are. Why not verify that you say who you are for the right to vote?
This idea that racial minorities and poor people don't have ID is just foolish, because in fact you need an ID for so many purposes in everyday life, including, by the way, in most states, applying for welfare or public assistance. Second, we know the effects of these ID laws. Why? Because Georgia's photo ID law and Indiana's photo ID law have been in place now for almost 8 years. They've had election after election after election there, and all of the predicted effects that this would suppress the vote of senior citizens, of racial minorities, not only have they not occurred, but in fact, the turnout, for example, of Black and Hispanic voters in Georgia has gone steadily up since the photo ID law went into place.
It is so ridiculous that people think that blacks and minorities do not have a photo ID. I lived in PG County, Maryland, which is one of the blackest counties in America, I will say, and we needed an ID for everything. If I wanted to take a $25 dress back to Dress Barn, I had to have a photo ID. It is ridiculous and insulting to say that blacks have not fully assimilated into American society to the point where we don't travel, we don't work, we don't bank, we don't do the common things that require an ID. It's insulting. And it's using black people as victims, as a crutch. A lot of times these minority communities are being used as a shield for criminal activities, and it has got to stop.
A poll that recently came out showed that 82% of this country thinks that photo voter identification makes sense. So what's the resistance about? If you are affiliated with the government in any way, if you are on any kind of social service program, you've had to show identification. If you've ever gotten on a plane, you've had to show identification. If you've ever bought Sudafed, you've had to show identification. So, what's the problem?
How many of our soldiers, have died to protect, our right to vote, and our right for our vote to count? And how many soldiers have been sent, to another country, to fight for those people to have the same right? So here we are, we're going all over the world fighting, unfortunately, some people dying, so that the rest of the world, where we can bring voter integrity and a democracy to their country, but in our own backyard, that integrity is deteriorating, and it's just wrong, and it needs to stop, because all these soldiers that have given their lives to make sure that it's protected, we need to be sure they didn't die in vain.
The question is, what do you tell to someone who's lost faith in the system because they've seen fraud, maybe they've personally experienced it? What I would say to them is, the only way to fix a problem like that is to get involved. And in the last 4 years, a number of citizens groups have sprung up all over the country of people interested in making sure that we have fair and secure elections. That these are nonpartisan groups. All they're interested in is making sure that when people run for office, the person that gets the most votes is the one declared the winner. And that's the way to help yourself to reinstall the confidence you should have in the system is go out and try to fix the problem, because you can make a difference.
What it really comes down to, we're all in this together. Men, women, youth, older people, Democrats, Republicans, moderates, liberals, conservatives. I mean, all of us have a vested interest, in the same vested interest, in making sure that we protect, our election system, so that we can be a Republican, or we can be a Democrat, or we can have a liberal view or a conservative view. And as a result of that, we can vote one time and one vote for who represents our view and how we want to see this country run. That's fair. That's how this country was founded. But again, it's one vote, one person, and it's for everybody. We're all in it together.
There is one thing that happened early in the process that I will never forget. I was working in the polls, I was volunteering, I was serving as an alternate judge, and it was in a primary where it was what they call a blended primary. So that means that the Republican and the Democrat parties were working together, which is great. Frankly, that's how it's supposed to be. We're supposed to be able to work together and come to some common ground. Days gone by, but in any case, inside of this poll, we were a great team. It was getting towards the end of the day. A little old man shuffled in with his, daughter, maybe. He was hunched over, and he appeared to be Asian or Vietnamese. I didn't know, but he had on khaki pants and a flannel shirt that had been washed so many times it was pilling. And he shuffled in and he gave me his registration card. Wow. This is... Okay, so he shuffles in and he gives me his registration card, and he just beams when he presents that card. He's so proud. And he goes over to the voting booth, and the woman who is with him stands back, and she's crying and I'm crying, and I was working for the Republican Party. My Democrat Party counterpart was crying, and she looked at us and she said, my dad's 83 years old, and he has just become an American citizen here from Vietnam. And this is the first time he's ever been able to vote. This is the first time anyone has ever asked him what he wanted in his government. And I think to myself, how dare we? How dare we be so careless with this precious gift? This is about so much more than checking off a box on a piece of paper. This is about maintaining freedom. If our elections are not truly fair, we are not truly free.
When an individual votes in a federal election, they should be required to show a state or local election official a current valid photo identification or a copy of a current utility bill, bank statement, paycheck, government check, or other government document that shows the name and address of the voter. Please go to stopvoterfraud.info and sign the petition to Congress and the President.